Welcome back to part two of our episode with Dr. Kurt Woeller. Today, we're going to get into the deepest aspects of mitochondria. So, if you made it through the first video, clearly you're a diehard like I am. And we're going to actually round it out into something practical and actionable for you as an individual or for you as a clinician when it comes to knowing what to do with all of this information and how to affect something positively starting tomorrow if that's what you choose to do with it. So, enjoy part two with Dr. Kurt. You said a lot of things there regarding glycolysis, beta oxidation. Kurt, I think we got to go a little deeper now. I think we got to go into the mitochondria if you're okay. I think we should give people a little bit of a background and in many cases a refresher of how do these things work? These mitochondria, they take the raw materials of the carbohydrates and the fatty acids that come in from our diet and they turn them into energy. And there's a very mechanical and I think a rather elegant process there. Can you briefly describe the process of making ATP energy just so everyone's on the same page?
Yeah, so you think of glucose, let's just simplify it. Glucose, fats, protein. Okay, so glucose is pretty straightforward for the most part. So glucose converts into pyruvic acid, right? So you take, let's say, one molecule of glucose, it essentially gets funneled down to become two molecules of pyruvic acid. Pyruvic acid gets converted to acetyl coenzyme A, and that happens within the cytosolic fluid of the cell. Okay,
Hmm.
so this is not happening within the mitochondria at this point. In order to convert pyruvic acid to acetyl coenzyme A, it requires an enzyme called pyruvate dehydrogenase. And it's actually a very complicated enzyme. It's a series of enzymes. It's called a complex. But
Hmm.
the bottom line is that pyruvate dehydrogenase complex enzyme requires certain nutrients, B1, B2, B3, B5, lipoic acid, throw in a little bit of
Magnesium.
magnesium,
Yep.
magnesium too, right? So you need thiamine, you need riboflavin, you need niacin, you need pantothenic acid, we need some lipoic acid. Throw in a little bit of magnesium on top of that. So if we make that conversion, okay, now we're at an acetyl coenzyme A level. Acetyl coenzyme A then enters the Krebs cycle, which is sitting in the innermost aspect of the mitochondria. So a basic structure of the mitochondria is you have the outer membrane, you have an inner membrane. So you have two membranes and then you have spaces that are occurring in between those membranes. So between the outer and the inner membrane is the intermembrane space. And then as part of the inner membrane, which is in many folds, if you actually look at an image of the mitochondria, to me, it almost looks like the folds of the digestive system. And those
Hmm.
folds increase the surface area. Embedded in that fold of the intermitochondrial membrane is what it's called the electron transport chain complex. And there's five proteins. There's one through five. So we have complex one, two, three, four, and five. And those complexes are essentially passing electrons down a chain reaction that ultimately at complex four converts molecular oxygen into water. And through that process of electron flow, we're getting an outflow of protons or hydrogen ions into that intermembrane space. And those hydrogen ions accumulate over the last protein complex of the electron transport chain to help create ATP. So as we funnel down from glucose to pyruvate to acetyl coenzyme A enters the Krebs cycle within the matrix of the mitochondria, which is that innermost part. It As it's spinning from one step to the next, it's producing NADH as well as something called FADH. So basically nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide and flavin adenine
Wait,
dinucleotide. So
I
we
know
basically,
those names. I know those names though. It sounds like vitamin B3 and vitamin B2, doesn't it?
that's right. That's right. So the NAD is linked to vitamin B3 and the FAD is linked to vitamin B3. Other way around.
B2.
The B2, right? So it turns out that the Krebs cycle connects to the electron transport chain. And it connects to the electron transport chain at complex 1 and complex 2. So NADH connects to the electron transport chain at complex 1, FADH connects at complex 2. And in order to get maximal ATP production, you want to connect or start the engagement of electron flow at complex 1 and complex 2. Okay, so that's essentially when you calculate out ATP production, per unit of glucose, that's ultimately how it works. If you're starting the process at complex 3 or even complex 4, you're just going to be compromised in total ATP production. So it turns out that you get amino acid and fats will also get metabolized down to the acetyl coenzyme A level. There's some subtle differences in that there are a few other doorways to the Krebs cycle as well. I'm really just kind of talking about the main doorway, which is acetyl coenzyme A. But biochemistry is very complicated, multi-layered. So there are other entry points, but if you just sort of think of it that way. And so as we process fat, as we process glucose and protein down, it funnels down to these energy production precursors. All of the sequencing that takes place is dependent on enzyme activity. Those enzymes are dependent in many cases on certain nutrients to help them move from one step to the next. But also those different conversion steps are vulnerable to problems because you can have a genetic influence on a certain enzyme. You could have a nutrient deficiency that might compromise a converting enzyme, or you could have a chemical, an environmental chemical, or sometimes endogenous chemicals that get produced that might inhibit some of those enzyme conversions. So for example, if we take it back to the conversion step of pyruvic acid to acetyl coenzyme A and that pyruvate dehydrogenase enzyme, right? We talked about B1, B2, B3, B5 is necessary for that enzyme to function. Well, it turns out that that same complex of pyruvate dehydrogenase, it's called something else, is also an enzyme that is active within the first half of Krebs cycle activity. And so if we are deficient in B1, B2, B3, B5, for example, we're not only going to compromise glucose metabolism and acetyl coenzyme A production, but we'll compromise Krebs cycle activity. So now all of a sudden we're affecting downstream what's happening in the Krebs cycle. Well, if we take it one step further, certain amino acids also get converted down to an acetyl coenzyme A level. And there is another enzyme complex that helps in that sequence. Well, that same enzyme complex is dependent on the same nutrients. So the B vitamins, the lipoic acid, the magnesium ingest the initial phases of initial amino acid metabolism, glucose metabolism, and Krebs cycle activity is dependent on this grouping of these enzymes that are then dependent on those specific nutrients. It turns out that within the electron transport chain, that's another very interesting area. And mitochondrial diseases, so what they sometimes call mitochondrial disorders, are really focused on problems at the electron transport chain level. So basically activity of what's happening along the intermitochondrial membrane. So we know that we engage the mitochondria with NADH at complex 1. FADH engages the mitochondria at complex 2. It's interesting in that complex 2, so when you think about mitochondrial genetics, so complex 1, 3, 4, and 5 are mostly made up of proteins that come from nuclear DNA. But certain mitochondrial DNA also produce protein subunits that support those complexes. It's only complex 2 that is 100% linked to nuclear DNA. And it turns out that complex 2 is a vulnerable spot in the mitochondria that almost in some respects physically connects the Krebs cycle to the electron transport chain. And one of the things that we see commonly on the organic acids test is that a chemical called succinic acid becomes elevated when complex 2 is compromised. It's actually linked to an enzyme called succinic acid dehydrogenase. And that particular complex is very vulnerable to environmental chemicals, but I've also seen it elevate and become compromised in many people who have underlying bacterial and fungal problems too. So I don't think it's necessarily 100% just environmental chemicals. Heavy metals can negatively impact it as well. So if we interfere with any of these complexes that are transferring electrons down that electron transport chain, the end result is poor ATP production. Complex 1 is the largest complex. It has the most proteins, essentially. It's the largest protein structure. Complex 3, I think, is the next. I think complex 3 is the next largest. The bottom line with that is that if we get deficits, whether it's nutritionally induced because of a complex, a complex 1 or complex 2 or complex 3, we're going to get electron leakage. If you can't transfer electrons from one protein complex to the next, where do those electrons go? Well, they end up leaking into the matrix of the mitochondria. And sitting in the matrix of the mitochondria is oxygen. And that oxygen reacts with those electrons and creates oxygen radicals, particularly superoxide radicals, but you can also get hydroxyl radicals that are formed. And so if we have faulty electron flow down the electron transport chain, we increase oxygen radical formation in the mitochondria, which then further damages the electron transport chain proteins, as well as the inner mitochondrial membrane, which is holding those complexes together. And kind of taking it back, by the way, interestingly, to the discussion we just had about short chain fatty acids. Butyric acid, as you mentioned, right, gets produced by a number of bacteria in our digestive system. Some of those are Clostridia based, and that's okay because Clostridia is part of our microbiome, but we have other bacteria as well. Well, it turns out that butyric acid not only helps induce more robust energy production, but it has other influences in the mitochondria, in many regards, helping to assist some of the electron transport chain complexes, as well as what appears to be sequences within the Krebs cycle. Too much propionic acid can actually have an opposite effect. It can actually inhibit some of the beneficial effects of butyric acid. And it turns out that propionic acid can damage some of the complexes, particularly complex 3. So we know that complex 1 and 3 are the greatest areas of potential electron leakage. One of the things, and why I have done so much study, and it's a continual study on mitochondrial dynamics, is one of the trends that I've seen in autism. And I don't know if this is happening in other health conditions, but my suspicion would be the same in other types of disorders, particularly neurological disorders, is in the autism group, the area of greatest deficit from my mitochondrial assessments has been at complex 3. And that's critically important because complex 3 is transferring electrons between complex 3 and complex 4. Complex 4 is the last complex that we're actually, at that point, converting oxygen to water. And then at that point, we're getting the last outflow of protons into that inner membrane space. But it becomes a deficit point because we're getting electron leakage, which is generating a lot of oxidative stress. And oxidative stress, to some level, as you know, Roland, within the mitochondria is necessary, but again, too much is problematic. Taking it one step further, if we have faulty function of moving electrons through the electron transport chain complexes, and we're getting leakage of electrons into the matrix that is generating oxygen radicals. Those radicals, again, then are further damaging other cellular systems in the cell, including the mitochondria, and specifically the inner mitochondrial membrane. And what's very interesting about the inner mitochondrial membrane is it houses the electron transport chain complex. And it's important for people to understand when you're talking about a high energy system in our body, brain, nervous system, cardiovascular system, for example. Let's just take, for example, a heart cell. Okay. A individual heart cell might contain 5,000 mitochondria per cell. It's not just one or two, it's thousands.
Yeah, the books don't do a good job of depicting that when we're learning it.
Right. And then in each mitochondria, we're probably anywhere between 10 to 15,000 electron transport chain complexes. So you have to think of these complexes as an individual unit. They kind of function amongst themselves, but they are connected in their collective ability to make ATP. And what's interesting about the inner mitochondrial membrane, as I mentioned before, it exists in folds, and that folding increases the surface energy. So, as you can imagine, in a high metabolically active organ system, in those mitochondria of those cells, there is more folds, which allows for more electron transport chain complexes. Well, sitting between complex 3 and complex 4 is another protein called cytochrome C. And cytochrome C is it's I look at this as sort of the inherent wisdom, right, of evolution or whatever dynamics you want to, describe it as. But it plays a very strategic role. It turns out that cytochrome C sits on the outer leaflet of the inner mitochondrial membrane. And its job is to help transfer electrons, the final electron transfer between complex 3 to complex 4 to help convert oxygen to water. And that's complex 4 then being the final stage where we're pumping protons from the matrix into the inner membrane space to then accumulate over the last complex to help generate ATP. Well, if there is excess oxidative stress, or there is dysfunction in the transfer of electrons, or we've got damage of the inner mitochondrial membrane for various reasons, whether it's chemicals, whether it's nutrient deficiencies, whether it's mycotoxins, whether it's eating too many seed oils that become oxidized, whatever. As the inner mitochondrial membrane becomes damaged, it releases cytochrome C. And a release of cytochrome C travels outside the mitochondria into the cytosolic fluid of the cell and activates a series of enzymes called caspases. And the caspase reaction essentially is a apoptotic trigger for that cell to commit suicide. You want that to happen, right? If we have a cancer cell, obviously we want, or a cell that is transforming into a cancer cell, we want an apoptosis signaling event to occur because we want that cell to be removed. If we have a damaged cell, we certainly want that to occur as well. The problem is that if we have too many cells that are malfunctioning, too many cells that are dysfunctional, then we get an excess apoptotic signaling event, and we're now destroying too many cells or taking out too many mitochondria, and that then lies or leads to these different types of mitochondrial disorders and manifestations. It could be happening in the brain nervous system. It could be happening in the cardiovascular system. It could be happening in your kidney, in your liver, in your gut, your immune system. It can happen all throughout the body in varying degrees. So it's a very interesting, and this is an area that I have been focused on heavily to try to understand more. Currently, I'm working with a few individuals who, have seizure disorders. And some of the genetic analysis that I've done and some of the mitochondrial analysis I've done, there's an absolute component to their seizure condition linked to underlying mitochondrial problems. I'm not claiming it's the only thing. But you don't have to have a serious condition like that in order to appreciate the impact that the mitochondria play. Again, just take it back to what we originally discussed: brain fog, memory issues, sleep problems, or anxiety, or I just don't feel, like energy like I used to have. It just can manifest in different ways, and sometimes in subtle ways. But when we get back to the fundamentals of health, gut health, diet, nutrition, lifestyle, eventually it has an influence on mitochondria and vice versa.
That was an incredible, I don't want to call it a recap of what medical school taught us that we probably tried to forget, but knowing things down to that level of detail, I always look at the fundamental pieces and how they come together. Then I hover over it and I look at the intricate design of everything. And all of that is basically the reason that explains why we eat food and why we breathe air. I love to ask medical professionals, what's the true role of oxygen in the body? and not many people ever say to be the final electron acceptor in the mitochondrial transport chain. But what you just said there, the nature of how the things come together, the separation of the electrons moving down the gradient and the protons being pumped out of the matrix, it just shows you that it's all about the coming together of balance, right? The positive and the negative coming together is actually what generates the ability for the body to make energy. But a lot of what I think should be focused on more is also we make structured water. There's even a term, I believe, for the water around the mitochondria that has a bit of a charge separation state. I think it's called the minos or something of that nature. So cellular water is also a huge component of this because water conducts electricity, and fundamentally humans, based upon the density of the mitochondria, how much electricity is being discharged in our body, we're actually more thermally efficient per square centimeter or square inch than the sun is, based upon the sum total of all the mitochondrial reactions going on inside of our bodies. And I think, although that stuff can seem incredibly intimidating for someone who goes, "Oh my God, I don't know any of this," as a clinician, you're not going to make better what's already perfectly designed. You don't have to go in and remodel and renovate a mitochondria to make a better transport chain in order to heal someone. What I was getting from what you were saying is understanding the cofactors and where they operate, understanding the external and internal influences and how they can enhance, because fundamentally the body does not know disease. The body knows to self-replicate and heal. And what's important to know, in my opinion, about mitochondria is they give birth and divide, or they fuse together based upon the dynamics of what's happening inside the cell. So if you have the inner world of a cell set up to be a healthy internal environment, you prime the system for the birthing of healthy daughter mitochondria, because a healthy environment is usually underpinned by healthy mitochondria. If someone is, as you said, filled with environmental toxins, heavy metal compounds, metabolic metabolites from bacterial, fungal, viral infections, then that internal environment is going to be ripe to create disharmony that is going to eventually breed dysfunctional mitochondria, giving birth to dysfunctional mitochondria. So, as a clinician, your goal is not to make better what already exists perfectly. It's to know how to remove the blockages or remove that which inhibits ideal function and to restore what might not be present that is holding back the ultimate ceiling. Because the one thing I do know about mitochondria is that nature is very intelligent in its design. It gave the woman the responsibility of passing on the genetics of the mitochondria to the kids. They knew the men would screw it up somehow. So, if you're listening to this and you're a clinician, you're dealing with expected mothers, people who want to plan pregnancies and plan families. The genetic starter kit you give to your child, both from a microbiome and a mitochondrial contribution, is from the mom. The healthier the state of health of the mom, the likelihood they're going to give birth to a healthier baby who's more resilient so they can recover after whatever insults their physiology may experience. So, Kurt, thank you for that. That was a wonderful description. I do want to round this one out by asking you, okay, now that we've looked at the high level stuff, we've gone deeper into the nuances of mitochondria structure and function. How do people approach mitochondrial diseases clinically? I know you said supplement, nutrition, lifestyle. What are some things that could be strategies to give people thought-provoking ideas and actions?
Well, when you get into the level of mitochondrial diseases, obviously you need to know something about those particular diseases because there are certain mitochondrial diseases that many of them manifest in childhood, and many of them are catastrophic. They can many of them can be lethal early on, or they can just be highly problematic, not necessarily lethal, but they can severely compromise a child's growth. Some mitochondrial diseases don't manifest until later in life. They can lead to blindness, for example, and other degenerative conditions. So they're not all the same thing. Um, when we're talking about mitochondrial dysfunction, which is a lot about what we work with, Roland, in our
Mm.
collective practices with people, you know, again, it's a spectrum, right? So these are not necessarily lethal diseases, but these are dysfunctional states that people can work on that, usually can be positively impacted through lifestyle changes. So I have been working with more individuals now with documented, mitochondrial disorders, which would be essentially be a disease. Um, I approach it. My approach is really, in many regards, to approach, pretty much everybody with the same intent. I want to try to understand some of the fundamentals of their condition, what I feel I can have an impact on, and what I feel I can't. If it's a disease state linked to genetics, it's pretty hard to turn that around, but you might be able to influence other biochemical aspects that might be affected downstream. So we kind of get back to some of the fundamentals that way. And going back to your mention of some of the roadblocks, what are some of those roadblocks? Well, an area I always start with is organic acid testing, because the organic acid test can help provide insight into fungal overgrowth in the digestive system, Clostridia compounds, oxalate, certain nutritional imbalances. I might need to look at a comprehensive digestive stool test to see if there's a parasitic infection or some other type of imbalance. And then, of course, you have environmental exposures, if that is part of the backdrop of somebody's history, mycotoxins, environmental chemicals, heavy metals. So we can look at those and try to remove those barriers as much as possible and let the inherent wisdom in that person's body and at the cellular level kind of take hold and do what it needs to do. Um, some cases in very serious conditions, you have to be aware of what may work for the general population may not necessarily work for that particular individual. I'll give you an example. We know nowadays there's a huge movement towards a carnivore diet, right? Carnivore diet, eat more meat, eat more fat, blah, blah, blah. It's the best way to go. All right. Same thing with a ketogenic diet. Certainly has been helpful for a lot of people, but there's going to be certain subset of individuals that it may not be the best choice. Because if you've got some kind of a fatty acid metabolism problem at a genetic level, well, you're not going to process heavy meats, And I came across an individual recently who has a condition, or at least it's suspected, something called glutaric acidemia type 2. Well, you have to really limit the amount of lysine and tryptophan that person's eating, because in their body, they convert it into toxic compounds. So you have, as a practitioner, you have to be willing to go back to the textbooks to push yourself into areas that maybe you weren't originally trained, or maybe you got a little bit in medical school or other type of health training, but aren't quite comfortable with. But you have to push past and keep digging to look for answers. And so my journey continues, in this particular area. Fundamentally, for people who might just be dealing with generalized mitochondrial dysfunction, where we pick up on some markers on an organic acid test, for example, that oftentimes can be helped, again, just fundamentally going back to nutrition, lifestyle, diet, using foundational nutrients just to fill in those gaps nutritionally. So there's a lot of ways of approaching it. It really comes down to the individual that's sitting in front of you. Are we dealing with somebody with a documented mitochondrial disease that's well defined from a genetic standpoint? And then we know what our limitations are, and then we try to optimize potential as best as possible? Or are we just dealing with, sort of the person who's like, hey, I just kind of tired. I don't feel great. Got some gut stuff going on. We can help those people too. So I always look at it this way. The person that comes to me, I don't always know, obviously, going in who they are, unless once I go through their clinical paperwork and I get an idea. But I'm going to do everything in my power to try to help them. And if it's in something I'm not familiar with, then I'll spend the time researching it as best as possible and try to figure it out. One of the things that I have seen, Roland, is that with some of the individuals with mitochondrial problems, when I look at what's being done for them, and I don't know, in every case, all of what's gone on, if they've seen other medical professionals along the way and they've gone through sophisticated testing, I'm a firm believer in trying to figure out as best as possible what's happening. Sometimes it's not possible in all circumstances. But in a lot of the literature that I've read, a lot of the interventions I feel just kind of fall short. Most of the mitochondrial literature, when you read about mitochondrial diseases, they talk about the use of carnitine and CoQ10 and creatine and some of the B vitamins to support some of those major pathways that we know are intrinsic to mitochondrial biochemistry. And then, they sort of give lip service to a healthy diet. And then, of course, they get into things which are absolutely necessary in severe disease crises where, people have, massive levels of lactic acidosis, or they're having cardiac problems. Those people need emergent medical attention. There's nothing wrong with that. But I often find that I guess the diversity of thought from an integrative functional medicine standpoint gets lost. It's almost like, here's your mitochondria, cocktail supplement. Good luck,
Hmm.
right? And that's not good enough for me. You know, um, Recently I came across some information. I read a great book called What Your Food Ate. And it's taken me down this path of going back and understanding the benefit and the power of regenerative farming. And I came away from that book realizing that the soil of the earth is the microbiome of the earth. And our microbiome of our digestive tract is like the soil of our body.
Hmm.
And maybe we can come back and have another discussion about, mycorrhiza and fungus and the relationship of fungus and all this.
I think we're gonna
But
have to.
but the so I I have a lot of things that come my way that I read. And I got to a point about, I know it was like 4, 5, 6 years ago. I didn't question if something came to my mind, if I heard about a book or an article, I would just go and read it. It's like I'm being told to do this for some reason. I stopped questioning. And so I would go read something. This was a book I actually had bought for my wife as a birthday present. It was on the bookshelf. I kind of walked by one day. I'm like, I need to read that. And I'm glad I did. And I actually picked up a couple articles. One of the articles was interesting on longevity vitamins. This person who was proposing this theory called the triage theory of nutrition. Have you heard about this?
I've not, no.
So his premise is that we have nutrients, vitamins. We think of, vitamin E and vitamin K and vitamin D and B vitamins as the only vitamins that exist. They've already been discovered. Nutrition's already solved, so we can kind of move on. Well, what they realized is that what person's theory is that you have nutrients that are really geared towards immediate survival, high states of stress. And a lot of them are geared towards, in the animal world, from a biological standpoint, survival, meaning we need to reproduce because the way to maintain our species is to be able to reproduce. So the body sequesters energy and resources, even down to the cellular level, even down to the mitochondrial level, for reproduction and immediate survival. And then you have longevity nutrients, which are there to help preserve life long term. Now, if you're constantly in a state of stress and threat, this fight or flight, this sympathetic drive, right? A lot of the nutrients that we use, and again at the biological level, go towards survival, but you compromise longevity. And it's only until you can get to a longevity state that you actually can start to engage or maybe become dependent, or the biology starts to shift towards long health. And obviously we want to have long-term health. And then there's this mixture, right? That there are certain nutrients that have play a role in both sort of things. The article is fascinating because it got into certain nutrients that have been discovered, one of them called PQQ.
Hmm. I know this one.
And yeah, and I'm drawing a blank on it right now about where exactly it comes from. But PQQ, certain vitamin companies actually have PQQ, and I've actually used it for mitochondrial purposes because one of the things in research of PQQ is it helps with mitophagy. It helps with mitogenesis. So it's not only inducing the development of new mitochondria, but it's inducing a mechanism to get rid of old damaged mitochondria, which is like autophagy, which is really important. I think it's called ergothioneine, which is found in mushrooms, which is a reason I'm going back to eating mushrooms, even though I don't really like mushrooms. But mushrooms are robust in ergothioneine, and they've discovered that ergothioneine is heavily concentrated within the mitochondria. It plays a supportive role to the various complexes, as well as having some antioxidant purposes. And there are some other nutrients out there as well. And so this article is discussing the fact that, hey guys, there's a lot of research. And by the way, there's likely other chemical compounds out there that we could classify as vitamins that aren't being classified in that way, and others to be discovered. The other thing about this book and the soil, and going back to regenerative farming and thinking about the microbiome, um, was how the microbiome becomes a transferring mechanism for nutrients in the body. And as we mentioned before, other chemical signals that have a cellular signaling unifying aspect within our body. It's known to happen within the soil, the communication between plants and trees, for example. And so it's a fascinating discussion. And so to kind of to finalize this, Roland, because I realize I've been kind of going on about this, but um, when you ask me the question about how I think about these things, there's the very rudimentary way of thinking about it. And then there's, is it enough? Are we doing enough? And is there more that we can do in thinking about the influence the mitochondria has on us and the things that we can do that have an influence on the mitochondria in a collective way? And I'm a firm believer, obviously, in fresh air and oxygen and exercise and getting out of nature, because that also has a major influence on us as human beings as well. So my journey through this whole path of medical education, functional integrated medicine, whatever you want to call it, um, is a continual journey to try to not only educate myself, but to try to make these, points of connection as best as possible. And the more I connect one thing, it leads me to something else to connect. So I don't ever see that puzzle being completely finished. And I'm okay with that. Um, if I can, eventually someday depart and having left something to the world, I'll be extremely happy.
Yeah, I have a friend who uses the term "done is for the dead," so I don't think you're going to be completing that puzzle anytime soon. But I really want to applaud that answer because you're right. The quick and dirty answer is get the mitochondrial cocktail, throw this in there. But there's really no greater systems thinking consideration in the physiology than dealing with the mitochondria. As you were saying things, it's almost like you see these patterns in life. And I remember one time what hit me was, well, if all humans are of the earth and the average state of health of the earth is going to be the sum total average health status of every human walking the earth, you're going to have variances, just like you have some areas that are beautiful, lush landscapes and some areas that are barren wasteland. But we're interlinked, we're yoked to the environment that we come from and ultimately our bodies go back to. So the systems thinking requirement in helping someone with mitochondrial dysfunction takes more than just learning all the vitamins and minerals that the biochemistry textbook tells you, because you have to learn the dynamics and the nature of how to influence these things. What I mean by that is you can use exercise as a mitochondrial stimulatory tool via driving up oxygen consumption and mitochondrial efficiency. You mentioned cytochrome C oxidase. That's what's called a chromophore. So exposing yourself to certain light frequencies at certain time of the day can enhance mitochondrial efficiency, melatonin production, mitophagy, cycle regulations, heck, even the kind of music you listen to or the electromagnetic fields that oscillate in your environment have influencers. Very documented research on the disruption of calcium metabolism with high levels of non-native EMF. So there is no short answer to the question that I asked, and I'm so glad that you said that, because one of the things that I've been saying is we need to bring back critical thinking to understand that as a health professional, you're not limited to the scope of the tools that you're assumed to have, in the same way that we don't have to just know all the vitamins that a book tells us that are in existence. So I think that's a wonderful idea. to put forth to challenge everyone to be better. Understand that you need to challenge yourself to know how all of these things come together because the tools of a good health practitioner are far beyond simply a bottle of pills, or a fancy biohack that may or may not work. You'll find out as you
Mhm.
do it. But, Kurt, we could keep going, and I always say that, and I'm sure we will. And I can't believe I get to use this in a statement. I would love to have you come back so we can talk about the fungus among us. We need to dive in to all the things that we were just alluding to in the end. But I want to thank you for your time. I want to thank you for donating your research, your energy, all that you've learned. You have your own education academy, correct?
I do. It's called Integrative Medicine Academy. You can go to integrativemedicineacademy.com. We're currently in the process of updating our website and incorporating all of our courses into one website. So at this point, I have personally produced probably upwards of about 250 hours of course material on organic acid testing to gastrointestinal problems to, fundamentals of functional medicine, mitochondria, and candida, clostridia, many other topics. So people can go there, integratedmedicineacademy.com. I'm also on Substack. So if you go to Dr. Woeller, WOELLER.substack.com, I try and post an article at least twice a week. Sometimes I might share somebody else's article or a video. I talk a lot about these concepts on my Substack. I've gone through things on mitochondria and organic acid testing and nutrients and other topics. So people can follow me there. It's free. And then I'm also active online. So I have a lot of YouTube videos. We've got our own YouTube video through Integrated Medicine Academy. Honestly, if you just type in my name, on YouTube or Vimeo, Dr. Woeller educational videos, you'll come across a lot of stuff that I've produced over the years.
Well, I'm hoping that this stimulated someone to want to learn more, not only about you and what you're doing, but to step up their game in terms of knowing and being able to positively affect those with mitochondrial dysfunctions. So, Dr. Wohler, thank you again for your time. It's been great having you on. It's always great to have a deep dive conversation with you, and I have a feeling there will be another one in the future.
Sounds good, Roland. Thanks so much.
You have a great day. Thank you,
Thank you.
everyone. Talk to you soon. Bye.